that's it. And episode 48 with Robyn Wolff here. And I want to introduce Robyn. She was introduced to me from Dr. Denny Allard, which was on my podcast about 12, 13 episodes ago. He's a trauma surgeon at the Dr. Chris Barnard Memorial Hospital in Cape Town. And I asked him about 10 days ago, I was like, I would love to speak to a psychologist about things because I'm doing too much bro science, and I would rather speak to a professional that actually has studied something and that has a more legitimate opinion than me. And he hooked me up with Robyn Wolff. And Robyn is a registered counsellor, and she is been doing this for quite a while. From the website mindheart.co.za, you can see her list of qualifications. She's doing she completed a postgrad in mindfulness. She is specifically doing trauma therapy, but there's a little bit extra which we'll cover. And to also legitimize her from a point of view that she's not only a counselor or psychologist, she's battled her own trauma, which is quite well documented if you start reading about it. Son David du Plessis, I think it was 2012 from my research, was doing an expedition in the Amazon, and he was going to cover it from, I think, the west to the east or the east to the west. And during the trip, he was ambushed and he was shot 5 times with a shotgun, and he had to survive. And the trauma that I read that just gave me goosebumps is he phoned his mom and said, "This is quite serious," when she asked him, "Are you going to survive it?" And I'm getting goosebumps just saying that. So I know the trauma that she's had to go through. So that is basically the introduction. This is a psychologist, counselor that has read up about a lot, but she's also experienced a lot. So welcome, Robyn.
Thank you, Melva, and thanks for inviting me to do the podcast for you. And yes, the trauma I had with my son, Davey, was off the chart. So not only being knowledgeable about it, I'm pretty well versed at going through the trauma on an experiential basis. So, yeah.
Do you ever get people... Yeah, because I'm sure a lot of people, I speak to a lot of people and they don't want to get therapy because they feel that the person that they're going to speak with are not going to understand them. And that's a very, I understand why they don't want to seek therapy because of that. And I know that their life experiences are maybe unique, but stress it's a relatable thing to any industry, any background. And there are people that will understand you. Is it the same with trauma? People are hesitant to seek therapy because they feel that the person they speak with might not understand them.
I think that maybe there is definitely an inclination for people to think like that. But I definitely think that the people that you go and see, you know, if they offer you a safe environment, you pretty much can be present with whatever's showing up in your life. The bonus here for me is that when people do come and see me, they kind of understand that I come from a trauma background and I've kind of done my specialization in mainly trauma. I don't know, my professor, when I did my internship, you know, said to me that you should become, you know, quite proficient in some kind of direction. And I don't know if it was the grace by God or it was fluke or what, that I had to go through the trauma with my son. So I think when people come to me with trauma, I can kind of really fill their shoes, you know, really empathize with them and feel comfortable with them, with their trauma, instead of feeling, you know, uncomfortable with what they're going through. So there's that commonality, and I think that builds a lot of trust, which is very important for that relationship to be built and to help with the healing of that person.
Yeah, and I think it's a bit easier to also take advice or suggestions from someone that you know that they have had to do the same. So, for example, I just want to give a quick shout out if my little brother is listening to this, Peter Steenkamp. he's had his own trauma last week where he caught fire with hot burning oil from the kitchen, and luckily he survived that, but he is hospitalized in Vietnam, and we obviously going through a bit of a battle there, but the biggest obstacles have been overcome, and he's going to be fine. And so quick shout out to him. And talking to Robyn this week, it's also like it makes me feel good knowing that she's had the same thing where you're stuck in one country and the person you love is stuck in another country, and there are language problems, there is payment and financial problems, and it's absolutely horrendous, and there's nothing you could do. And you basically throwing rocks into darkness on the internet, hoping that somebody will come back to you.
Yeah, you know what it thinks? It generates a feeling of helplessness. And I think that's kind of the ubiquitous thing about trauma, is that it brings up that sense of helplessness where you feel, and I felt it too, where you feel totally helpless. But there's an amazing thing about that, in that there is a resilience in you, that if you build resilience, that gets you to be able to manage and take action, and your body goes into the stress response where it gives you the energy to do it. You know, people say with trauma, the stress response is a negative response because you get a surge of adrenaline and cortisol and norepinephrine. But the thing is that mobilizes you to actually do stuff, to engage with people, to take action. So the sympathetic nervous system does help you in those circumstances to take action. And
what would you?
Okay, yeah.
Please, you would hope.
I hope your brother's okay, and I mean he will be okay. He's got a good support system with his brother, and that's another huge thing about any form of trauma. I think the most important aspect of whether you can see somebody getting through the trauma is the support structures. People who have poor support structures very seldom really make it through without developing major PTSD, you know. So I think that we underestimate the power of just having a supportive presence there when you're going through a trauma.
Yeah, and thank you. And my brother did relay that that he is feeling supported and he is feeling loved. And what we've done is I've asked the internet to record little 30 to 60-second video clips of just sending some love and support, because again, it's lying in the hospital, no matter where you are, it's a strange feeling. And especially if you've got things stuck on you and there's machines beeping, it's not a nice feeling, and it can be quite scary, and it can be quite a clinical lonely place. And just having a bit of warmth and love and intimacy makes the difference. So there's been hundreds of videos coming in, and he said that is just helping to get his spirit right.
That's good. Yeah, I mean, those things all definitely help. Yeah? Yeah.
So I want to get on my list, because we're not going to be able to get to all my questions and observations to Robyn in this podcast, but I'm going to try and see how much we can accomplish. So my first question to you is, other than, for example, your PTSD type of things where you have a car crash, you're in the military and certain things happen there, what would you classify as trauma? And how do you know you've actually experienced it? Because maybe you don't know that you've had trauma in your life.
I think basically somebody would realize they've had trauma, because trauma is a really very physiological. It's felt in the body. I mean, because of the stress response. And you know, you get 3 types of trauma. You get acute, you get chronic, and you get complex. So acute trauma would be an incident, and it could range from a car crash to a burn to a gunshot. And then you can also get continuous, which is the continuous kind of trauma where you can have from child or continuous abuse or in relationships. And then you get the complicated trauma, which could be from the military, where there's one traumatic episode after another. And what all these traumas do, they are deeply distressing and disturbing to the person and the psyche of the person, which then renders them pretty helpless, because then they stop, functioning. You'll start noticing flashbacks, hypervigilant, hyperarousal, all kind of symptoms of trauma that is very noticeable to the person because their daily functioning is hampered. But generally, these kind of symptoms last up to about 3 weeks. And then generally the person, if it's acute, but if it's complex and chronic, it's longer. But generally the person starts to kind of feel better.
And what would be the more subtle examples of this continuous or chronic type of trauma?
I think it can represent as a kind of a melancholy or a general anxiety that is ever present, that is there with you, and it seems to be your default setting. And that can be from a trauma that is unresolved, because what happens with trauma, it gets stuck in the body. And a lot of trauma comes from childhood that is unconscious. And as we know from research, is that the trauma is held in the body. So just like a muscle has a memory, a cell has a memory of trauma. So it can be triggered anytime. So sometimes people are not aware that there's unconscious trauma from childhood, and there can be triggers, and they are not conscious of it because it's held deep in the body and in the implicit memory, which is an unconscious memory. So it kind of comes out in fragments. So people are generally aware, and they would know that they're not functioning well, or they're feeling dissociated and feeling very anxious, or feeling depressed, or very vigilant, or very aroused. And that would definitely mean that there's some form of trauma, and it can be present all the time until it's resolved.
And childhood trauma, is that like, for example, my mom or my dad shouted at me, or I don't know, somebody broke into our house when we weren't there, but the idea that somebody was in our house, my dog died, we were financially struggling for a long time. Is that the type of examples of childhood trauma?
Definitely. What trauma does to somebody is it takes away your safeness in this world. So by losing a dog, we have a kind of predictability about life. We kind of imagine life to be predictable and safe, and we can kind of trust life. So when you go through situations where the family is under stress, the safety is rocked in a family. You see people being very, very reactive. So you'll get people being angry, displaying, certain temperaments or behavior. And definitely all childhood, because we're so used to being regulated by our parents in our home. And so when they're not present, it definitely causes trauma for the child. And most addictions and most like really acute or more complex traumas definitely stem from childhood. And remember, it's not only so much as the event, it's how the person deals with that event. So when you go through a trauma in a young child, do you have the support? Do you have somebody who's co-regulating you to feel safe again? So anything could really be a trauma, but those things would all be childhood traumas. But you can overcome a lot of them if you've got people in your home and parents who are, don't let you learn to become helpless themselves, and if they're able to help you to co-regulate your nervous system. So those definitely do make a difference.
Do you feel that the stubbornness that Afrikaners possess makes it difficult to deal with trauma? Because we're not allowed to, these cowboys don't cry, and you're not allowed to acknowledge that you may be going through some hardships. Have you noticed that type of cultural upbringing provides a challenge dealing with trauma?
I think not only with Afrikaans people, with a lot of men. That they're not, there's no, as a child, when you're a girl, for instance, when you are crying or you are upset, your parent attachment figures usually acknowledge that, and they regulate you by allowing you to have that experience. But as young boys, when you cry and you do that, there's nobody there really mirroring you. So you learn to not have these emotions because they're not safe to express them, because nobody's taught you that it's safe to have them. So then as you grow older, you're not able to articulate, and these feelings are repressed and suppressed, and over time they do come out, and in anger, which is a secondary emotion, but it's all fear-based. So definitely the culture and the conditioning from childhood, being able to express your emotions with it being mirrored back to you, has been safe to have those emotions, is not very present in men from that generation. and I would hope that it's changing now, that men are able to be expressive and have the whole catastrophe of living, the whole myriad of emotions, which are just emotions, with them being safe to have them. And again, it comes back to the safety of it. Is it safe for me to feel like this? Is it held safely by another person?
Yeah, I think we're definitely in the right direction on all fronts in humanity and as a civilization. Maybe some of them we take a few steps back and then again forward. I think we are learning, and I can definitely see my brother that's been in the accident now. He's about 7 years younger than me, and I can see the kids or his peers, they grew up in a slightly different generation where it was slightly more acceptable. I still grew up in the 90s when Nirvana was cool. You were all emo, and it was almost like popular to cut yourself, be a Hell's Angel, get tattoos, and have all these sideways methods of expressing your emotion. If you're angry, then tear your posters up and slam your door, like classic 90s. And I think nowadays it's a lot more acceptable to be a bit more emotional. Like I see kids going out and having smoothies and stuff at Kauai, where it's like in the old days, like if we had money, like one, I would probably go booze and smoke some weed over the weekend. But like if I weren't to do that, it would be sweets or cinema or burgers and chips. So I think there's definitely a direction of just being slightly more healthy from all aspects.
Exactly. Well, I mean, talking about the alcohol and the weed and that, it's definitely kind of an escape from the feelings that you have. So, I mean, it's a way of self-medicating because it gets uncomfortable, this emotion, and you get very uncomfortable. And where do I take it? What do I do with it? So people then, it starts off by just numbing or dulling the pain or escaping from it through different forms of recreational drugs and alcohol.
Yeah, and I want to speak about, neurological pathways, because something that this is not a podcast about me and my PTSD, but or my trauma. And we'll talk about why both of us don't like the term PTSD and why it's not a disorder. But I've had my fair share of trauma, and something that's come up for me in therapy has been neurological pathways and how certain things in the brain has been formed, and we can almost reshape them. And you were speaking about experiencing emotions. I still find it very hard to cry. It's something that happens very rarely for me, and crying is normally associated with headaches. And I can access feelings for a little bit, and then it's almost like there's a short circuit in my system, and I go blank. I always say it's like that movie Men in Black, where Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones, they've got that little thing, and then they wipe out someone's memory, and suddenly all emotions are gone. And it's almost like my body eliminates the feelings and thoughts so that I can just go into rescuing whoever's in a traumatic position. And so can you speak about neurological pathways and how trauma influences that, and how we look at neurological pathways to become healthy again?
Well, first I'm not a brain surgeon, but what I know about trauma is that it definitely has huge effects on the brain, and it affects like the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the amygdala, which is your limbic system. So what happens is that in any trauma, there's a biofeedback. So you have a traumatic experience and you feel it in a sensation in the body, with the heart beating faster, the pulse rate, getting faster, your breathing getting shallower, and that sends a signal to the brain, and then the brain would send a signal back. So there's like a biofeedback. But with a progressive trauma, sometimes that biofeedback stops due to people numbing themselves out. So there's a kind of a break in the message from the gut or the body to the brain. And I think that the good thing is that because of the neuroplasticity of the brain, new neural networks can be made through healing and through therapy and through different modalities of treatment. But when I'm hearing you speak, is that I'm hearing that, from your conditioning and your upbringing and your experiences that have been pretty painful, is that you kind of numb out. And you often hear people saying that they feel numb. And that it goes to a lot of people who have sex addiction and promiscuity, is that the body becomes totally numb because there's the lack of connection between the body and the brain. So the body stops feeling. So, there's no relationship between that. And I think that is what trauma does. But with help and with proper social connection and learning to feel safe with your own body, when you start feeling safe with your body, then you can, start developing, changes in the brain. And also the mindfulness approach, which is a very powerful antidote for all of this too, and changes structures of the brain. I mean, there's a lot of research out there that there are changes in the brain, and there's a plasticity of the brain. So it's not the end, These things can mend itself, but they do definitely have neurological issues. You'll know that in some trauma, you can notice in the short space of time how people lose their speech, they get dissociative amnesia, they're forgetful. So those are the short-term effects on the brain too, and long-term effects on the brain. Remember, the brain and the body is one. There's a connection, but it gets faulty, and trauma can make it faulty, that connection.
Yeah, and that brings me to my next question, which is how to explain about how trauma sits in the body physically. And I was a little bit hesitant a few years ago when someone said, but maybe you have some physical problems because of this trauma. And I was like, no, this is a mental and emotional activity. And slowly it went into, no, but there's definitely, I have hormone shortages. Like I have very low testosterone, and if you test me, like my testosterone is very low. So I know the symptoms might be, I know also from my brain damage from having over 20 concussions, that's also influenced my brain capacity and my hormone levels. But I went to America last year, and someone told me that if you do yoga, then maybe you can access certain trauma in the body. And I was very doubtful of that. And then I went for my first yoga session, and I finished the session. And I looked over to my friends. I was like, I feel a bit emotional. And they're like, what? And I started crying. And I was like, I don't know what is going on. And I was very emotional. And since then, I'm like, okay, there's definitely some connection with trauma in the body, and certain exercises like yoga allowing you to access that. So could you speak on that, please?
Okay, so what happens with trauma in the body is that when a trauma event happens, there's a reaction in the body. You have the autonomic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system gets your defense up either to the fright or the flight. And with that, there is a surge of chemicals. There's norepinephrine, there's adrenaline and cortisol. And they serve you in that event because it either, and there's also the immobility of like you see it in animals where they get to the stage when they actually look dead, and they collapse, to prevent the person or the animal eating it, or their fright or their flight. So when this happens in the body, there is a surge of chemicals, which are hormones. But the problem is that when the event is over, the narrative keeps playing over and over again in the thought. So it keeps triggering the same chemistry over and over again, even though the event has happened. And that really started where they first decided on PTSD or diagnosed it was from the military, is that when people came back from the military, they were home and their environment was safe, but if a chair dropped or a door banged, they would be triggered. And so the body was in this constant hyper-vigilant, hyper-aroused state, which means at the same time, these chemicals of adrenaline and cortisol are going through the body. First of all, it compromises the immune system. And the body can't function just on the sympathetic all the time. You need to also use the parasympathetic nervous system. And where you suggested, where you had that experience with yoga, is that it's the parasympathetic nervous system, which is actually the rest and repair part of the autonomic nervous system. And when you went to yoga, the most important thing about the parasympathetic is it brings back the breath. And with the breath, there's also a nerve in the body called the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is in the parasympathetic nervous system. And the vagus nerve, when it's calmed down, helps the body to calm down. So that's why you had that experience at yoga, because yoga is all about breathing and being in touch with the body. And that changes chemistry then to acetylcholine and GABA. And those chemicals, we need to. We can't function. Your body cannot function on adrenaline and cortisol all the time. It's like an engine. You'll burn yourself out. And that in itself compromises the immune system, causes inflammation, which then is the seat of all diseases. So you need to be able to regulate yourself. And the regulating is to turn down the volume in the nervous system so that you can rest and repair, which is the parasympathetic, which yoga does, with meditation does, with moving your body does. And remember, trauma, because it's felt in the body, you need to go to the body to try and be with the trauma to help transcend it. So that's really what happens in the body with trauma. And the vagus nerve, it's a very interesting nerve. And there's a psychiatrist that I follow a lot of his work. His name is Stephen Porges, who does the polyvagal theory. And he suggests that to people, like yourself, who've been through trauma and who's struggling with the after effects of it, and you mentioned the crying, is that the breathing, which is actually involuntary reflex in the body, you breathe yourself. But the amazing thing is that you can make it voluntary. So just the breath in, and more especially, which people don't tell you, is the breath out is literally more important. And the breath out, if you have a long exhale, you push against the diaphragm, you stimulate vagal tone. And vagal tone is very important in getting the body into the rest and repair. We just get told breathe, but if you're just deep breathing in and in, you can actually get yourself pretty worked up. That's what panic attacks are, So when you slow the breathing down is to really pay attention to the exhale, and long exhale, because that stimulates the vagus nerve. And that's a powerful tool for people who have got anxiety disorder, panic disorders, who feel overwhelmed with trauma, is to use the breathing as a tool, because it stimulates parasympathetic reactions in the body. And the reason why you cried is because your body was in rest and repair, and then the body uses the wisdom of the body. And the wisdom of the body is perhaps for you crying, which is also an involuntary, which is the wisdom of the body uses it to regulate yourself. And the interesting thing that the scientists, put tears under a dark-sided microscope, and when they looked at tears, the tears have the same chemical compound of morphine. So, it's an amazing pain analgesic. So if you relied on the wisdom of the body, because the body ultimately wants to survive. If you had to close your nose and close your mouth, your body would want you would take your hand away, because it's designed to survive. It's in your DNA, it's in your genes to survive. And there's massive wisdom in the body. The problem is why people develop such traumatic, go into disorders, is that they have the sensation in the body, which is stimulated by the hyperarousal vigilance and the startling, and then they launch into a narrative on that feeling. And usually the narrative is really what complicates the trauma. It's the story you create after this feeling anew. So what mindfulness is where mindfulness is so potent with this, is to notice when you are in the narrative after the sensation in the body, is to become acutely aware of the fact that you are in the cognitive part of the feeling, and dropping into the body and grounding yourself in this moment, feeling your feet on the floor. And that is a way that you can kind of come to the present moment, because generally the narrative is about the past or the future, and it's to teach you to be in here now. And the breath is another aspect of anchoring yourself in the here and the now. And that is a way of making your body feel safe. Because the moment that you slow the heart rate down, the body sends a signal to the rest of the body, we're safe. And that's basically what you're trying to achieve with trauma, is to allow yourself to feel safe again. So we use people to co-regulate us, and we use our nervous system to regulate ourselves. Is this making sense to you?
No, it's definitely making sense. I think it's just a lot more complicated, not complicated. I think it's just a repetitive exercise to achieve what you are saying. I think going into, when you spoke now, I watched the interview with one of my favorite fighters of all time in mixed martial arts. His name is George St. Pierre, and he's considered as maybe the top 2 best fighters of all time, maybe the best. And something that he used to do is, as he walked out towards the fight, he would touch his nipples. And they asked him, but why did you do that? He's like, well, they're very sensitive. And what they did was they just brought me to the moment. And it worked. And I just continued to do that because there's so much anticipation for the fight and everything. And then once you actually walk out to the ring, all you're thinking of is this fight. And he just used to almost like flick his nipples. He's like, it just brought me to the moment. And all I could focus on is here and now. And that's definitely something I think that's tricky with how you say, like people like myself. I've been formed and shaped in a way that my body's almost conditioned not to be in the here and now in certain moments. And what you need to do for therapy is be in the here and now. And this whole mindfulness and yoga, it's quite a challenge for me to be present. And a lot of times it's a massive challenge. And you mentioned the word GABA. I started taking GABA supplements a few months ago, and I started taking a few different supplements. Could you speak on some of those type of things and the effect that I'm taking, for example, radiola, 5-HTP, ashwagandha, GABA? Are there some of these type of supplements that one should maybe look at taking that will assist you in getting something that you maybe not getting enough of due to trauma?
Okay, well, let me go to the first question about, you said the mindfulness and you finding it difficult to get to the here and the now. Mindfulness is probably the most difficult thing for anybody, because generally the mind becomes the CEO of us. And what mindfulness tries to achieve is that you become the CEO of the mind. So basically what you need to do is you need to train yourself to pay attention to the moment. And it's not something that's instinctive, because we are used to the wandering mind. And the research is that the general default setting of the mind is a wandering mind. And the wandering mind is an unhappy mind. So that's our default setting. So of course it's going to be difficult to achieve that. But we train the mind, and that's where the meditation comes in, is that you learn to train the mind to pay attention to the moment that you go into meditation. And the moment that you notice that you've launched out into the story, into the mind, when you notice that, you're already mindful, you're already in the moment. And that's really what meditation is training the mind to pay attention to the now. So, and then back to the I'm not a medical doctor, so to be able to tell you what supplements to take and what not to take, I mean, I certainly am not very clued up about that. I mean, I don't take any supplements. Really, I believe that nutrition is more important, and exercise is more important, and getting good sleep is more important. And I think those things would be more stimulating to the body. And remember also that I think when you realize that you have the capacity to heal and that you're able to do it, it's more empowering, But I think that, if GABA or those chemicals help you and you feel better about them, then, go ahead. But I'm not qualified enough to tell you much about supplements. I mean, all I know is that I'm firmly entrenched in the pillars of well-being. And I think that is more important than any supplement. Nature, you can't get a better supplement than nature. If you went into nature, you get, it's a source of life, So those things to me are better supplements. And, Dennis Allard, you were mentioning, I work with him in the Christian Barnard with his patients, is that I always, say to the people that the way, you manage trauma, and if you're going to get through trauma, is if you really focus on your pillars of well-being, and it's the mindfulness, the eating, the exercise, the 7 hours sleep a day, and the social connection. If you're using those in your life as supplements, adding value to your life, you've got a far better chance of getting, somewhere and progressing in your life. So.
And why do people that experience trauma, and I put my hand up here too, and I see this regularly, that they don't feel like socializing? What is it that happens with the mind, body, soul that makes you feel like retreating into a bit of a hole and into your shell like a tortoise almost?
Yeah. You see, people who get trauma, well, it's like shell shock, literally like a tortoise, it's shell shock. So you do isolate and you do kind of, go into your shell. And the reason why people do that is, first of all, people who traumatize, some part of them feel that they're going to be burdensome to other people. There's their whole life worldview. It's called depersonalization, is that their whole worldview has been altered. They don't feel safe in this world. They don't feel like this world they fit into this world. So the isolation is a way of coping. It's a defense mechanism because they don't trust life anymore. They don't feel safe going out. So it's a defense mechanism, but it pays off, but doesn't pay off for a long time. But we have a natural inclination, and I think it's a balance, because I think stillness and being by yourself is a very healthy thing, but to withdraw and to socially isolate is going against, the grain. We are social creatures. And I think that's why even with this pandemic, with people being in isolation is going to trigger a lot of trauma, because the way we feel safe in this world is to be in communication with other people, because people regulate our emotions by hearing and witnessing us and honoring us. So, if trauma people are encouraged to do that, the social isolation would become something of the past. But it's very difficult because their bodies are, first of all, in a state of very hyper-vigilant, very hyper-aroused. So they're safe, they feel safe in the home, but it's a temporary state. It can't be forever, because it will create more depression, more anxiety. But it's a natural defense of traumatized people. But just like a tortoise, you go into your shell, but when the tortoise knows that the threat is gone, the tortoise kind of comes out. But the problem is people, we don't do that. We keep the narrative going. So we need to reframe the narrative so that it's safe to come out of your shell. And that's what, professional people help people do, is to reframe the story so that there's no need for them to continue to isolate themselves or withdraw.
So the questions that come up is, what do people do that don't have a nice support network and a nice social environment around them? How do they go about it? And one option I think that you'll say is therapy, but what do we say to people that don't have funds to access therapy? What alternative ways to therapy are there?
Well, first of all, what everybody has access to is nature. Nature will heal you by default. On the earth, there's a major charge of negative ions, which is what we need for that's part of grounding. And if you go to waterfalls in the beach, there's a conglomerate of negative ions. So you need to go there and it will heal you by default. Moving the body. Everybody can walk. A lot of trauma, people walk it out, walk. You can move the body. But firstly, people need to have the willingness to want to heal and to, work through their trauma. Everybody's got access to nature. Everybody's got access to their breath. Everybody has access to going into nature, moving their body, exercise. So you don't need the money. And also remember that your body is designed to heal. If you're to burn yourself, I've seen people who've been burnt, imaginably, that's disfigured. And I've seen how the body heals without anybody doing anything. So the brain doesn't know the difference between physical and emotional pain. But the reason why we don't heal from emotional pain is we get in the way of the body's natural wisdom to heal by creating narratives around it. So if you allow the body and you worked with your feelings and you were present with it and brought a lot of compassion to yourself, compassion What alleviates suffering in this world? Compassion. And very few people understand the importance of self-compassion. So when you bring self-compassion to all of this, the body's natural wisdom is to heal. You know, your bones are healed when they break. You burn yourself, it heals. The body is designed to heal, and it wants to heal. Your body has your back. So you need to be very conscious of your narratives, really, where your suffering comes from, and to bring more self-compassion, to do self-compassion exercises, and to bring compassion. And what compassion does is also brings the chemical of oxytocin. And as you know, ecstasy, MDA, it mimics oxytocin. And one needs to only just put your hand on your heart and to comfort oneself. You can produce oxytocin, and that's an act of self-compassion. So people with money don't need to heal. You've been given nature, you know. I mean, and there's also a lot of talk about cold water therapy, going into the cold water. It stimulates the nervous system, breathing. We have plenty access to other modalities to heal. There's also the tapping, which is another thing. So, you know, you don't really need finances. And people who don't have other people there, a lot of us are sitting alone in our homes we don't have people. But, you know, just going outside and even smiling at another person and being acknowledged, because you kind of witness, it's that namaste. I recognize the soul with you, you recognize my soul. And I think that's what we do as people, is just acknowledge and bear witness to the fact that you're alive. So we complicate it a lot. So people who are on their own need to find ways to communicate, to move their bodies, to go into nature, to manage to get through this. And yeah. Does that answer your question?
That definitely does answer my question. I can relate to that in the sense that just after my brother died, I moved onto a farm, and we were basically right in the mountain. And I had 2 dogs, and one dog was a very social dog, German pointer, and it just wants to run for 10 hours a day, and it wants to play with you. It's a me and you dog. And I always say this dog single-handedly took me, and I don't like the word depression. I think that's a bit of a blanket umbrella term for just some specific feelings. But I was definitely going through a very difficult time. And this dog almost single-handedly got me out of it, because we were just spending time together, and we would just spend time in the mountains, and we would do that for 2 to 3 hours a day. And so I can definitely speak for that. Spending time in the nature really helped me. I think what I also hear from you is that, or something that I would like to say, is that if people maybe listen to this, I would assume that it's also being patient with some of these things. It's not going to come quickly. For example, when you speak about self-compassion, it's something that I struggle with. It's like I was raised almost like I'm never good enough. And I've had times where I'm super proud of myself. And then, for example, I would get from my parents that it's maybe not good enough, or you should have thought about it differently. And there's these weird things of, I'm just really hard on myself, and that creates this position where I just struggle to sometimes have self-compassion. It's something that I've learned to have. It's something that I can practice, but there is something in my head that it's very easy for me to go a bit into like, don't feel sorry for yourself, just get on with it. It's all mind over matter. And it's a bit like, dude, you know what, this isn't nice, this isn't cool. And the weird thing also with this compassion, I listened to an interview with your son last night, and I did a bit of research. Support comes from the most random places in the world when you least expect it. And my experience with trauma, severe trauma, when people die or they're about to die, my experience with it, the people and friends that I thought would be there were not in my life supporting me, and the most random strangers suddenly came into my life and said the most amazing things, or they did the most amazing things, and it brought me to tears just that I don't know how to explain that, but was that your same experience with you, where some people you thought might be supporting you during trauma weren't there, and people that you didn't expect suddenly came into your life?
Well, first of all, let me get back to, the patient side, is that our minds want to heal something very quickly, but the body takes time. So we need to be very patient with the healing process as you go along. And then getting back to your question about, the people, I think I've learned in my experience that I have little expectation. I don't have an expectation of expecting people to heal those parts of myself, because I've been a pretty resilient and pretty resourceful person. So, but I'm probably more touched by random acts of kindness that I see. Like if you stop at a robot and you see somebody being kind to a poor person, those things touch me. So I think those things bring up a level of compassion in me. When I see those, when I saw when my son was shot, the compassion of people who did what they did without any expectation or any gratification from that. And I think that's where the story of Viktor Frankl, where it's the book on Man's Search for Meaning, is that he said that in times when you go through hard times, is that you have to find meaning in this. And I think lots of people find meaning and a purpose in being kind to others. Like you see with this pandemic, there are many people feeding the homeless people. People are showing compassion. And this is an opportunity where people probably didn't realize that they had the capacity to be compassionate because they were never really given the opportunity. So now I think what's more important to foster is compassion for others. And when you foster compassion for others, you will generate more compassion for yourself, because compassion for others automatically brings a sense of safety and stability in oneself when you are doing acts of kindness and acts of compassion. There's so much power in kindness. And I think that instead of trying to be compassionate to yourself, be compassionate to others. And in that, you will find that whatever you're trying to heal will heal by default, because it's such a great act, which we realize how powerful it is. And I think that the way the mindfulness helps with the "I'm not enough," I think that's a common thing that we all suffer from, that we're not enough. And it's to acknowledge that you're not enough, and to be okay with that. To not create a narrative around that. It's to be compassionate towards the fact that I'm not enough. And it's okay to feel like that. And when you're kind of okay with that, the suffering goes away, because you're not fighting against it, I'm not enough. You're just acknowledging it, I'm not enough. Who is ever enough? I think we'll be fully enough when we're all in the grave, And I think the push for the I, you need to reframe the I am enough and say, well, if I'm not enough, what more can I do to grow and to expand myself, and use it, reframe that I'm not enough, and not create a narrative around it that I'm not enough, therefore I'm bad. There's a judgment. It's to take the judgment away. And that again is where mindfulness is powerful, because it's a non-judgmental approach to your narrative and who you are. And again, it's a story you're telling yourself. When you say you're not enough, there's a feedback into your body of creating this feeling of not being comfortable, and pits in your stomach and heaviness and pressure behind the eyes and that. So it's reframing and noticing how much time you spend in that I'm not enough, I'm not good enough, and to come and drop more into the body and take a deep breath and go for a walk. And not ruminate over that story. Story. It's not the truth. And a wonderful mindfulness teacher said that the thoughts in the mind are actually just like little children coming to you thinking that's what you need right now. So just bring compassion to your thoughts. Okay, your thought thinks you're not enough. It's okay. It's only a thought. It's not who you are. So it's not to make that who you are. You're more than that. And that's where the self-compassion comes in, is to be compassionate towards the fact that we are, faulty to some extent. We are all insecure to some extent. It's common humanity. It's a human condition.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely somewhere there. I don't want to get maybe too personal, but it's somewhere there. It's what's happening in my head is that I'm okay with not being good enough. It just pisses me off that somebody else says that or thinks that, and then rather than going into compassion, I'm a bit like, fuck you, how dare you judge me on any level right now because I'm having a hard time, and just the fact that I'm putting one foot in front of the other, it's a fantastic accomplishment. So I don't ever go really into self-pity. I go into anger, and I sometimes wish that I would just find the balance between self-pity, anger, and then in the middle we've got a bit of compassion. Listen, this person's not perfect, I'm not perfect, no one's perfect, and but something that I'm doing is I'm just choosing the people that I allow in my life. I think one of those common phrases, choose the people who is allowed to have an opinion on your life. But I think that's very easy to say that. It's very difficult when some people do actually comment on your life and they are close to you. But it's definitely an exercise of just choosing the people. I cut out people that I don't like, and it's a very interesting activity, being a human, being an adult, and just trying to live a good, decent life.
And you know what, it takes great skill to master yourself, because usually when people have comments about yourself, it's generally a projection of them, because if they didn't understand that, they wouldn't be able to know it. So if they know it, they will recognize it. So it's to also understand where boundaries come in, is that when people are critical of you, it's a reflection of them. It says more about them than it does about you. And then to have great skill in the way you react to that, and take a pause more, and then go from a place where you respond from that. And I think that's a very skillful way of managing your relationships and your conversations with yourself and other people. And it takes mastery. And you need to become competent. Socrates said, and a life that's not examined is not a life worth living. So you need to really bring a deep curiosity to all your experiences, and be curious about why you're reacting so heavily to somebody criticizing you, because deep within you, what is going on? And it's just like going into the body and feeling where the sensations are. My heart is beating, my chest is tight, and to just deep breathe. You don't need to launch into a story about it. And this is where the skill comes in, is you need to master yourself, and it takes great skill, but it's a skill well worth learning.
So I see we're at about 53 minutes. So I'm going to try and wrap it up in 7 minutes. So two things that I wanted to ask you. I don't normally talk about this because I belong to a fellowship that believes in anonymity. So I'll just say that I'm part of a 12-step fellowship. And with this fellowship, I've accomplished 17 years without drinking and drugging. And the cool thing about this fellowship is, like, if you really buy in, what they tell you is go help others. If you want to forget about your problems, go help others. And I speak to other, like we say, almost like normal people, because they don't belong to these types of fellowships where you have severe problems in a way. And it's almost like I want to give them the advice of go help others. But then they're like, but where and how do I get involved with helping others? And then people have this weird concept, but you've got to save someone's life like a firefighter to help them. So my first question is, how can the average person get involved with just helping others? And the last question that I might want to finish on is, why do we need to be hesitant to call it PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and why is it maybe not a disorder? So those are my two final questions to you.
Okay, well, getting back to helping other people, you don't have to go and do extraordinary acts of helping people. It's just acknowledging people. It's acknowledging the person, right? Seeing them and smiling at them, helping them, passing compliments, being kind to people. Now at this time of the pandemic, there's so much vicarious suffering that we see, that just by bringing peace to what we see is a way of helping, So we don't have to actually physically go out there to help others, by you becoming a better human being and you being kinder to animals and maybe looking at your dietary habits. Personal changes have a massive effect on collective consciousness in this world. So helping others is really, and because it is difficult for people, they don't know how to go and help people, and people then feel bad because I'm not helping somebody, therefore they go into that whole narrative. Honoring other people and trying to be as respectful and mindful towards other people goes a great way in common humanity and being a humanitarian. And with the diagnosis of PTSD, listen, PTSD is very real for people who've been in the military, and there's some people that I've worked with have been through the most horrendous trauma. And it definitely can develop into a disorder. It can. But the wonderful side too is that you can get PTG, which is post-trauma growth, which I try to look for in the people that I work with, especially the people who have gunshot wounds and they wake up and they are quadriplegics, is to try and let them find some hope. And I think hope is one of the most important things that we can encourage in ourselves and in others. And I think that definitely goes a long way in growing out of your trauma, because we're all going to go through trauma. And also we're living in a time now where it's not so much post-trauma, we are in continuous trauma. So PTSD probably is not going to be a diagnosis because there's no post-trauma, there's just trauma. So it's pre-trauma and it's continuous trauma. So we have to find great skill in how we manage in our lives. So and hope and know that nothing's permanent. There's impermanence. So nothing is forever. It will change. And to try and bring, peace to the situation and to have an acceptance, that this is it. And show up today, show up today. Do the best you can. Be kind. Be compassionate to others. I think we're here to serve. And I think when we have that, many things come right in our life, and we can grow out of all the trauma. I mean, I know the biggest traumas I've been through, the darkest hours of my life have been the most growth, because nothing does grow in the light. And the last thing, about helping other people is that people say, you've heard the saying, you've got your heart on your sleeve. I think people need to have their heart on their face. And I think that is the most powerful thing that you can do to affect change, is to wear your heart on your face. And people, will see that. And that changes people. There's power in that.
Awesome. And I think just maybe, I sometimes I'm open, sometimes not, but just for the sake of openness, if people were wondering if I say what trauma I experienced, there's a few things has been traumatic, but there was one period in my life that was very traumatic. And what was difficult about it is that my brother died at the age of 31, and there was a slow death of 5 years of having cancer. And he was this 120 kilogram guy. And by the time that he died, he was 70 kilograms. He was a skeleton. And knowing for a year that he's going to die, but I couldn't tell anyone except me and my dad knew about it. And then in the process, I nearly got a divorce. I went bankrupt. A month later, there was a gang initiation and my brother was stabbed. They tried to kill him and he luckily somehow got away. But then I had to be a first responder to that. And then a few months later, my dad got leukemia and he nearly died. And then in business, somebody stole all my life savings, and a variety of things happened in the space of like 6 months. And it's like every time I tried to get ahead in life, like another thing happened. And it was just quite rough. And here in Stellenbosch, in just outside Cape Town, we have mountains, and each year the mountain burns down. But each year after a mountain, there's this really beautiful pink flower that grows. And I like this metaphor in life. I definitely distinguish my life pre my brother's death and post my brother's death. There's definitely a certain approach that I've had to living life until 6 years ago. and there's a different approach that I've had to life since then. And I'm so proud of the life that I've had since then, because it's a little bit more involved. It's a little bit more geared towards just living a full life. I've always been like that, but I've really just, something was holding me back. And since then, it's almost like the gates were open to these racing horses. And it's just like, dude, fucking go for it. And so my experience is trauma has given me the opportunity to reassess who and what I am and how I want to go about things. And it's not nice. It is fucking terrible. But again, my wife, the relationship we have, we're both proud of ourselves and the type of things that we're doing right now. And if none of those things happened, would we be in the position that we are now? And so for me, definitely trauma, it's not nice, but there are very, very golden silver linings to it.
Yeah, and you've developed good resources and you developed resilience, because like I said, it's not so much it's the event, it's how you deal with the event. And you've developed a lot of inner resource. And I noticed that when you speak to yourself, you are bringing a lot of compassion to yourself. You know, you're recognizing how proud you are that you've managed to keep your relationship together, and the fact that you're still showing up. You know, there's definitely levels of compassion that I hear coming out from yourself of how where you come from and where you are today. And you know, it takes an enormous amount of courage. And sometimes, you know, I always say to the people that I work with that what we really need in this life, there was a guy called David Hawkins who wrote a book on power versus force, and he wrote about all the levels of emotion. And he said that the one emotion, which is very true, that if you live from this emotion, you become a steward or stewardess of your life, and you get out of victim mentality, and that is courage. And you never develop courage until you have to be courageous. And I think that you have been put into situations where you've developed courage. And when you have that courage inside of you, it's like a burning flame in you. And I understand it because I have that in me. There's a burning flame in me of courage. And you're courageous in spite of what you face with. Because if you're courageous and you do stuff in spite of that, your trajectory of life is definitely catapulted forward and not back into victimhood. So you've displayed enormous courage, and I mean, you can be of enormous help and support to people because you can empathize with them. You know, you've been there, done that, and yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you, Robyn. And I think the closing statements I want to make is that if you have experienced trauma, you are welcome, or anyone's welcome to contact Robyn. Or if you want to, if you're an audio listener, go to mindheart.co.za. All the links will be in the description box. You don't need to contact Robyn, but if you wanted to, you're more than welcome. She's also got a few audio things on the website where you can do a bit of mindfulness or yoga or the body analysis type of thing. So go check that out. And then I would like to close with what I heard your son say. I can't paraphrase it, but if you have not experienced trauma, they asked him, like, how did you survive this ordeal? And what he said, and I really like it, is that I've lived a certain lifestyle that contributed to me being strong enough to deal with the trauma once it hit. And he mentioned his raw veganism. And then he also said the support structure and just the general good-heartedness of strangers helped him deal with it. And I think that's a very important message, is to live a certain life, nutritionally, lifestyle-wise, mentally, emotionally, that will allow you to deal with whatever is coming. And normally it is inevitably coming in some shape or form. And mindfulness, I would need to do another podcast to actually talk about everything I want to with you.
Perfect. Yeah, I mean, and that's a great closing statement, because it's basically that you need to be prepared for trauma. And if your lifestyle is good, and you are not drinking too much, you know, using drugs, alcohol, all the pillars of well-being, you are very prepared for trauma, and you will bounce back because you're grounded deep. Your roots are deep. So thank you. Thanks for letting me share. My website
Thank you.
is outdated.
Yeah.
So my website is a little bit outdated. I haven't really, spent much time on it, but somebody can always contact me. I think my number's there if they need somewhere I can refer them or suggest something for them. I'm happy to.
Cool. I'll put that in the description box.
Okay. Thank
you so much, Robyn. I've really enjoyed this, and I'm going to stop recording and we're going to continue chatting off air.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Bye.